Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar for the month of August. My name is Madison Slater. I'm the EVP of Security and Operations here at JSCM Group. And this month, we're going to be talking about establishing a strong network and systems for the organization. Think of it from the perspective of when you're a kid. So if you were a kid that was allowed to eat any kind of sweets that you wanted, your parents didn't really try to police that, guess what? You become an adult that probably has a really strong sweet tooth and you have a hard time getting rid of that. If you are not a child who is very active, as you become an adult, it's hard to go to the gym and pick up that exercise. We have to start simple. We have to start at the beginning to really institute anything of importance. And the management of our environments is no different. So, we've talked this year so far about some of these bigger things, and we're trying to prepare ourselves for the end possibility, which is that we have a security incident, but we can't get too ahead of ourselves. So this is an opportunity for us to pause and say, okay, let me take a step back and look at it from the day-to-day aspects. I decided to do this month's webinar a little bit differently because we always sort of build up to, talking about the situation and talking about the issue. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about the policy and the things that you should have incorporated there. I wanted to do this month a little bit differently because this particular policy that we're talking about, there's a lot of different aspects that you can have inside of that. So I want to talk about each of those individually and really try to break it down at that level. But I'm going to use this for the opportunity to talk about the thing that we need to care about and why, and then how we implement a policy. So I've got about 8 different things that we're going to go through. This is a starting point, I think, from a policy perspective, but there are definitely going to be more things that could pop into your head that you think, oh yeah, I need to have that in my policy as well. So let's start with our new computer setup. Now again, we're starting at the basics. We're going back to the beginning from an IT perspective. And like I said earlier, if you are on the IT side and you realize that your organization does not have a policy of expectations that are in place, this is your opportunity to create that for the next person or for your team. So when we talk about the new computer setup, so computers are obviously like the thing that our people are using to interact with our network, to interact with the internet. We need to make sure that the computers themselves are set up in a proper fashion. If I am just going out and buying laptops or desktops and I'm bringing them in and I'm just, haphazardly slapping applications on them and then putting them out, I don't have any consistency. It's only a matter of time before I've got the risk of a major security incident. So from a policy perspective and from a process perspective, we need to think about how are we setting expectations for creating or setting up new computers. So some of the things that I try to integrate into a policy for new computer setup are setting the expectations of what's involved. So what type of applications are we going to be installing on our computer? So when we're thinking about it from the policy perspective, you can have a definitive list that says these are the things that all of our computers in our organization are going to have installed. Now that should include things like your endpoint protection tool or product. You should never put a computer out that doesn't have some type of EDR on it. This can include other applications that you might utilize for your organization. And maybe that's broken out by department. So maybe for your techs, you're going to have a set list of installed applications that are going to be ready on the computer for when they start. For your general users, it could be, we just really need to make sure that we've got Office and our endpoint protection, and we aren't really installing anything else. But determining what applications, what's your baseline, what are you installing on that computer is very important. Other things that your policy should cover are what are your expectations for users and their ability to administratively manage their computer. In other words, how are you controlling local admin or user admin privileges? Now, if you're asking me, I'm going to tell you that your policy should say, we do not grant administrative privileges to users unless specifically specified by their role, such as IT. And even then, we're going to have set guidelines for how that is handled. But you need to set the precedent. because the whole point of having a policy is that you are setting the expectation. So again, thinking about this from the perspective of this is a document, this is something that I can hand a new IT person and say, here's what is expected of you the next time we get in a computer. Those are the types of things that you need to be putting into that policy. Another thing that I think is really important for us to have from a network and systems policy perspective is how are we tracking our assets? So it can be a bit of a monotonous task to track all of the equipment that your organization has, especially the larger you get. But asset tracking is really important because you need to know what you have so that you know when to replace it, so that you know if you had a possible security incident, what devices might be impacted. Asset tracking is also often important from the financial side of the organization. If you go through an audit, they're going to ask you, what devices do you have? So having an asset tracking process and written policy is going to set you up for success in all of those areas. So a question that I try to answer in this policy: how or where are assets being tracked? Are assets being tracked in an Excel spreadsheet that's stored in a particular Teams folder for the IT department? Cool, your policy should say that. Do you have a particular program or tool that you're using for asset tracking that's going to be installed in the computer and that relays back to some database? Cool. Put that in your asset tracking policy. And by the way, make sure under that new computer setup, it says that that asset tracking software is a required installation. Who is responsible for it? Who is ultimately responsible for making sure that assets are tracked? Is that your IT department? Is that your accounting department? Who is it? How often is it reviewed? How regularly are you going through and doing checks on that asset list to make sure that someone didn't forget something? Asset tracking, it seems, again, we're getting a little bit down into the weeds here, but if we have a compromise and we don't know exactly what devices we have out there, how do we know that we've cleaned them all? If we're rolling out new endpoint protection software and we don't have a list of all the computers that we actually own, how do we know that we're installing it on everything? So asset tracking as an activity is really important, and the policy just helps us indicate or outline what the expectations are for that process. Patch management. Again, we're down in the weeds on this, but because all of these things, if these aren't handled correctly at a higher level, we run into issues from a security perspective. Patch management. Patch management is one of these things that I know it's been, anyone in IT has heard it preached for decades at this point. And why? Because we're still not getting it right, because we still run into situations where we're not updating our computers. I'm going to say this right now before we get into the details of this policy. You need to be updating your computers every month. Computers, servers, update them. If you are not, you can get breached because they are going after vulnerabilities. There isn't an excuse anymore. We need to be updating our systems. Don't worry about if you feel uncomfortable rolling out service updates or feature roll-ups. Don't worry about it. You should be implementing security patches though. Okay. So from a patch management policy, what we need to include are things like, how are they being managed? So what's the process for actually installing Windows updates? Because let's face it, we're mostly talking about Windows here because they love to roll out updates regularly. How are we managing those? Is that do we have a centralized tool? Do we have a remote monitoring or management tool that we've rolled out that's going to be on every single one of our endpoints that automatically pushes it? If we do, that needs to be listed in our patch management policy. And again, going back to that new computer setup, we need to make sure that that's on the list of required applications that's installed. Are we doing it manually? Sometimes you just don't have the budget to be able to buy a tool or pay for a tool that can do it. That's okay. List that you're doing it manually. And if you are, who's responsible? How often are patches being checked? How often are they being pushed out? Do you have a testing process? If you do, that needs to be listed in the expectations, because again, we are setting the standards for what we are doing as an organization to manage the base security of our environment. Another important piece of our systems, network and systems policy is about removable media. And this is often a hot topic because sometimes we don't know exactly how we handle this. So I can't say what is good or bad for your organization. In general, I try to avoid removable media, but of course there's going to be exceptions to that. So what your policy needs to do is set those expectations for your organization. And the very first piece that you can answer as part of that is, are you allowing it? Does your organization allow removable media? If it does, what type? What is allowed to be added to removable media? Is it just for a certain subset of users? Only IT individuals can use removable media. If you're not using removable media, or if you're putting any type of restrictions on it, how is that being managed? Is that being managed through your endpoint protection software? Does it have the capability to stop that? Is it something that you are managing through a group policy that you're pushing out? Regardless of what it is, that needs to be outlined as far as what the expectations are for how that's being controlled. Another thing that we should absolutely have in our policy is our multi-factor authentication. If you don't already have an MFA policy, this is a perfect opportunity for you to write one. But what should be included in this policy? What are you using? What systems is it required on? So for us, as an example, we use a program that requires that we install an app on our computers. So that's listed in my policy that we're using that. And again, going back to that new computer setup, that's in my list of required applications installed on every computer. How is it being controlled? What situations will MFA be enforced? We need to make sure that we've outlined all of the basics there. Network infrastructure. Now this can get kind of deep depending on how far you want to go, but let's just start. Let's say we don't have this in place at all, so we need to create this initial policy. How do you manage changes to your network devices, to your switches, your APs, your firewalls? It's probably different by device. So how are those changes being managed? If it's a firewall, do you have any type of centralized management piece that you have to log into? So if you have something like a FortiGate firewall, do you have a FortiManager that you have to log into to make changes? If it is a cloud-based firewall, how are those changes being managed that way? How are you auditing changes? So if I'm an IT person and I go in and make a change, how is that being tracked? Or can I just do whatever I want? Set the expectations for me of how I need to manage those environments. We also need to make sure that we include logging as part of this policy. Logging is really important, and especially for certain types of organizations that are under certain regulation and compliance requirements. But what type of logging are you doing? Are you only logging your Windows event logs? Are you only logging firewall logs? Are you only logging MFA logs? Are you logging all of the above because you have a SIM? You need to set what the expectations are, and if there are new systems being set up or being implemented into the environment, how they need to be added into that logging. How far back do your logs need to go? If I'm setting up a new logging system, if I'm replacing the SIM that I had in place and putting a new one in, what are the expectations that the organization has for how far back our logs go? Where's that data stored? How is it stored? When is it reviewed? Who reviews it? Whose responsibility is it to go in and make sure that the logs are actually being gathered? Logging is very important, and especially if we are talking about worst case scenario when we've had a security incident, we're going to need to backtrack to see what happened. And finally, equipment disposal. So after we went through all the processes of making sure that our equipment was well set up and it's reached the end of its life, What is the process for disposing of it? How do we make sure that data is removed or deleted or wiped from a computer or from a server, from a firewall, from a switch, or from an access point, anything that could have data on it, from a printer? What are we doing with that equipment? Where does it go? Do we use a recycling company? Are we office spacing it and taking it out to a field with a baseball bat? Which one? Either way is fine. You just need to make sure that the expectations are set, because what you don't want is an IT person that has to go replace a computer and now they're walking around with a laptop saying, I have no idea what to do with this, so I guess it's just going to sit in a closet. Or I guess I'm just going to throw it away? Question mark? I don't know. Set the expectation of how you're going to be controlling the disposal of the equipment, because what you're also talking about is the disposal of the data. Again, all of these things are getting down into the weeds, but we're tying these, we're pointing these out and trying to tie all of this together because it is the starting point. If we're not implementing secure practices in our day-to-day, or even in just the initial implementation of all of these systems, we're setting ourselves up for failure. We'll never be able to go in and really institute true change if the core of our processes is weak. You have to start with a strong foundation, and your strong foundation, honestly, is your day-to-day management of your network and your devices. That's it. A lot of people look at system admin work, at the day-to-day IT, as being lesser, as being not as shiny when it comes to security or anything like that. But I will tell you, because I sat in that role for many years before I moved into security, the things that I did directly impacted the overall stance from a security perspective for the organization. And I look back on it now, I have a lot more knowledge from a security perspective, and I think about some of the things that I did or did not do because those expectations were not set for me. And I was unintentionally putting those organizations in a lesser position from a security perspective. So now I need to make sure that for my organization, even if I'm not doing the day-to-day IT, I'm thinking about it from the higher level and setting the expectations for anyone coming in for us that would be handling our internal systems. It's so important that we start at the beginning. And if we didn't already have this in place, that we go back and we create it. Which is why, as always, we've created a starting template, network and systems management process. Feel free to grab this if you don't have one. If you do have one and you just want to take a look at ours. Now, again, much like any of our templates that we've done this year, it's fairly generic because obviously I can't put a lot of the details in that are going to be unique to your environment, but it's a starting point. It's a starting point to get you set up with the correct process and the correct policy to set these expectations. I started with 8. You could have 50 in yours because you need to think about the uniqueness of your environment and the things that are happening on a day-to-day basis from a network management or a systems management perspective, and you need to put all of that in there. It's so important that you really take time to consider what is going to be unique. Again, think of it, okay, if I'm going to hire an IT person tomorrow, what do they need to know to make them successful, but also to make sure that they're not taking us backwards from a security perspective? And if something comes to mind, that's what you put into this policy. But this at least will give you a starting point that you can build off of. Throughout the year, I know I've said this at this point 8 times because this is our August webinar. Throughout the year, we've been trying to look at all of these different areas of security to help you make improvements. These are things that we've gone through ourselves. These are things that we help our clients with on a day-by-day basis. I always want to try to make the point, this is not a destination. It's a journey. None of this means that in a month we will be able to stop thinking about the security of our environment. All that we're trying to do is make sure that we're on the right path and that we're setting ourselves up with proper policies and processes so that we're not falling too far behind and we're not just putting ourselves in a bad position where we could eventually end up with a security incident. So somehow, again, this is already August, I guess last day, tomorrow is technically September. So our September webinar, we're going to be talking about employee management, not how you handle HR issues or anything like that. We're going to talk about how you manage employees from the cybersecurity side of things. So we'll have a lot of cool ideas there that we'll be able to talk about. And, we're coming up closer and closer to the end of the year. So in October, we'll be doing security training ad awareness. Obviously, we have typos here at JSCM as well. November, we're going to be building a communication plan. And then finally, at the end of the year, we're going to be talking about incident response. So thank you all very much for your time this month. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions that you want to go ahead and send over, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to me directly by email. You can always call us here at JSCM. We love to hear from you all. If you have any feedback for us on these webinars, any suggestions on other webinar topics you would like to hear us do, or if you just want to pick up the phone and call and ask for our opinion, I at least am always happy to share those. So thank you all very much for your time. If you do have any questions, go ahead and send those over. Otherwise, hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you next month.